All righty then. Welcome, everybody. I'm not going to show my face very much here, but I wanted to welcome everybody to this session. I'm uh, I'm pretty excited about it, actually, as usual. It's our 49th, which is hard to believe, but let's get going. So um, you can see Scott's picture here. He's not going to necessarily be a co-facilitator, although I saw he was the first person in the attendees list. So, and I think he knew that I was going to give him credit. One of the things that I love about our work, and I think it has a lot to do with the simplicity of our performance thinking models, is that they really do cause. I keep learning stuff, and they do really give us a framework for conversation, for thinking about different situations, for gaining new insights. And I've been working with these models really since the 80s or early 90s, and I keep learning things. So this is one of those examples. And as it says there, Scott and I had a conversation a while back that prompted me to start thinking about this. And he's actually the one that used the metaphor about Goldilocks, not too big, not too small, not too hot, not too cold, whatever. So what we're going to talk about here today is accomplishments or work outputs. And it really started out for me in a certain way around the issue of chunk size. But let's get into that after a minute. I want to mention next month's session first. Peter Doms will be with us again. It's an encore with Dr. Peter Doms. And I've known Peter now for quite a while. And he's a PhD in behavior science from quite a few years ago from one of the premier programs in the country, the Western Michigan University Behavior Analysis Program. And Peter and I have known each other for quite a few years. And in 2022, he's been doing strategic planning for 25 years or so with a lot of organizations, including part of NATO, or excuse me, NASA rather, small organizations, medium-sized organizations, profits, not-for-profits, cities, et cetera, et cetera. So he's had a lot of experience with strategic planning. And although I've never been in a session of his, what I do know from people who have is that he's an extraordinarily skilled facilitator of strategic planning. I always think of it as the herding cats challenge. But a few years ago, Peter was in our practitioner program, and we talked, of course, a lot about accomplishments and being accomplishment based. And that led to a conversation around strategic planning and how it was possible to take strategic objectives that come out of strategic planning and be sure that they're accomplishments, that there's things that we can say have been achieved or not. They're not activities. My favorite example, I cite all the time from a real case in Peter's work, is a mid-sized airport he was working with, regional airport. And one of their strategic objectives had been to, I think, investigate whether they should build a second runway or not. And when I heard that, I said, well, how long are they going to investigate? Isn't the output or accomplishment a decision about whether or not to do it? And of course, we laughed about that. But since that time, Peter has been sort of engaging the discipline with his clients of being sure that they wind up with major accomplishments as their strategic objectives. And we talk almost every week about things, and we both learned a lot about it. So this is going to be a great example, another example of how we learn because of the network of people who share this framework. And we're going to have Peter talking about what he's learned since then, in almost 3 years since then. And if you're interested in the background and you're either watching live now or you're watching the YouTube, the QR code on the left is the talk that a session that we did several years ago, and the one on the right is how to register for it, just to make it convenient for you. So getting back to the topic of today, what really got me thinking about it was, I don't know, 6 months ago or so, and I've always been puzzled by the word coaching when it's applied in business, because if you apply coaching in athletics, it's not non-directive therapy. It's not asking you a bunch of questions to see what you might have to say or what you think the problems are, and then asking you more things about, so you will come up with your own solutions. It's no, we want to get the ball in the net, and I'm going to show you how to do that and enable you to accomplish that. And so I've always been puzzled that in the business world, where accomplishments or outputs contribute to organizational or business results, coaching isn't more accomplishment based because our methodology is. And I was trying to investigate that. And one of the things that I began to understand was that business coaching, all the different models out there, of which there's lots, so some of you may be certified in them, they tend to focus on business results or personal matters, but let's say it's just related to the business. And business results are big, relatively abstract things, as we'll talk about in a few minutes. You can measure them, but they are typically aggregate things. And, aggregate of a whole bunch of sales, aggregate of a whole bunch of widgets that come off the assembly line, whatever it is. And when you focus on business results as sort of what you're trying to accomplish for a person or help a person accomplish, and you don't have accomplishments, you don't actually have work outputs, there's a kind of a vague relationship between the behavior we would need you to perform and those results. And so I've been thinking about that for a while. And then Scott and I were having a conversation where I was reviewing a beautiful project that he did as part of his certification. And that's what led to this discussion. And so, what we were thinking about at the time, and I'll show you one example from his work and some other stuff about what's the right size for an accomplishment. Because in another context, for example, when we're doing executive coaching using our methodology, which we do sometimes if you ask a senior executive what they're responsible for, they'll say something like a financially viable, organization. And that's not their accomplishment. And that's not their outputs. Their outputs are things like decisions, plans, goals, feedbacks, et cetera, good hires, decisions of all kinds. And so sometimes people come up with these giant accomplishments or outputs that are really hard to work with because they're aggregates or they're giant and sort of too big to be able to figure out exactly what the steps are for this, let's say, CEO to produce. On the other hand, we can be too small, and I want to investigate that a little bit. So, what is the right size is what this prompted. And what I realized when I went through, when I started thinking about this, was that there's been an evolution of accomplishment-based performance improvement over the decades. And it really started with Tom Gilbert. It started with some other colleagues of his at the time, too, but Tom's the one who wrote Human Competence, and most people kind of attribute the focus on accomplishments to Tom. And then Joe Harless, who was probably Tom Gilbert's most important protege, took what Tom had written and turned it in to a really actionable approach for performance analysis, for building job aids, for developing curriculum focused on accomplishments. And then I have developed both a certification program for performance improvement professionals and a coaching program that we've developed over the years in our companies, and also begun to understand that we can do accomplishment-based talent development from the beginning to end. And so there's been some evolution in this that I would like to step through, because one of the things that happened, as you'll see, is the distinction between organizational level business results and outputs or accomplishments, I think is a very important one. So let's start out with Tom. He talked a lot before he actually published the book. I think, in fact, I may have met him even before then, but I don't remember. In any case, his thing was shifting to accomplishments. And there's this slide that I've probably used in every presentation I've done for a decade or more, maybe 20 years. And it's an excerpt from that book. And he says, in the great cult of behavior, behavior itself is viewed as an end rather than as a means to an end. We must enable people to produce accomplishments, the valuable products of behavior. So Tom, in what he called the world of work, was shifting the focus from behavior, which is costly and which isn't necessarily useful until it produces something valuable, to the valuable products of that behavior, what he called accomplishments. Now, that was a big philosophical shift. And I would say about human competence, even though it's still taught in graduate schools, that it's a brilliant work of philosophy that Tom and his wife Marilyn produced, but it's not quite as actionable as it could be. It's not quite as step-by-step actionable. Now, one of the ways in which it sort of, shifts a bit from what I think, let's put it that way, is that accomplishments are described at a whole lot of different levels. And there's a lot, and if I look out in the field of performance improvement at the International Society for Performance Improvement and organizational behavior management people who focus on the products of the behavior that they're trying to manage, there's a lot of kind of discussion about accomplishments. And so we coined the phrase work output several decades ago, so that this is what we're talking about when we say accomplishment. So that was sort of our phrase for it, if you will. Now, if you continue from that and you take a look at what Harless did, Joe job aided what he did. He was a brilliant creator of performance guides or job aids. And at least three major of his contributions. One was what he called front-end analysis, which was originally described in his book, An Ounce of Analysis is Worth a Pound of Objectives. But he refined that into a workshop that many of us, I certainly did, and I think there's some people in this group who did. And it was step-by-step job aided down to the last nit. And then he created the Job Aids Workshop, which I always loved, partly because it's called JAWS, the Job Aids Workshop. But no, it's a really good tool set. And it also was job aided. And then his sort of magnum opus was ABCD, accomplishment-based curriculum development. And so my description there, of course, is a reliable job-aided accomplishment-based performance improvement. Because I used to have conversations with Joe, and he would say, he said, I'm watching your experiment real carefully. And what he meant by that was he precisely job aided things down to the level of defining accomplishments, level of importance. I mean, there were a lot of check marks and fields on his job aids, let's put it that way. And instead, I said, I'm going to create really simple models that people can kind of grasp and then think flexibly about how they would apply them. And he used to say, well, I know there are people who don't necessarily like all my job aids, but the problem is the more I job aid it, the more consistent the results. So it was a powerful methodology, especially for those organizations that were large and wanted to establish a standard framework like the Coast Guard, Boeing, and some of the other big companies he worked in. Now, I went back this last week and took a look at some of the job aids in his materials, and here's one. It was one page. What an accomplishment is and is not. Without considering level of detail or types, an accomplishment is an output of behavior which has value to the organization's business goals. As he used to say, and Gilbert said, and Hog Lindsley said, what we leave behind. Now, his examples include widget sales, answers to customer questions, and so forth. And then non-examples are call to customers, understand thermodynamics, et cetera. And what he pointed out was that an accomplishment is an output with a noun as the focus of statement, which is what we also say. He says it's not behavior, it's not the past tense of behavior, like completion of some behavior, and the verb is the focus. All good. He then, though, went on to talk about the key to recognizing accomplishment is the first word in the statement. So, paint the door starts with a verb. So that's clearly behavior. Decide the color. That may be behavior, but it produces a decision. So it started to get a little bit fuzzy in that language. And then this is where I realized, and I hadn't thought about this for a while, but I sort of broke with Tom, because what you see there is in his examples of levels of accomplishments, he talks about organizational accomplishment as profits from products. And as you'll see, I don't see that as an accomplishment. I see that as a separate thing, which is organizational business results. And I'll talk about it and so forth. And we're going to step through these slowly. But this is the way he thought about it. So, for example, job accomplishment included product sales. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean a sale, a thing, a closed deal? That's fine. But product sales may be aggregate measure of sales revenue or something like that. So the language is a little fuzzy. Or for example, major accomplishment sales presentation. So we'll talk about that a little bit. So then you got me, and I was learned from both of those guys. They were among my most important mentors for years. I'd go to conferences and stick to them like glue. I went to all of Joe's workshops. I invited Tom Gilbert up to Boston to do workshops. And we developed, based on an accomplishment-based approach, our two main programs, which are the Performance Thinking Practitioner Program that some of you have been through, and it certifies people based on the completion of an analysis and design process for some real problem, real opportunity in your organization. And then the Performance Thinking Coach Program, which we're currently revising to make completely virtual, but it's about applying the very same models to helping individuals develop. And so what I think is different from what we did, from what previous people did, what we did, first of all, the simple models. The intention was to come up with very simple visuals, mental models and visuals with plain English that was user tested. So we were sure there were very few category areas that people could learn the language and then not make mistakes. And then the next point, which is something I want to emphasize, we distinguish between organizational level or business results and accomplishments. So this is the model that you all probably know, or many of you do. This is what we call the performance chain. And what we say, of course, is that you have organizational results, things like revenue, profit, client satisfaction, so forth. You have work outputs, which are all things. As Joe said, they were nouns. They're all things, though. That's an important point we'll come back to. And then, of course, we have behavior, which is described as verbs, and we have all the things we do to try to support that. And so we also have a logic that we teach, and we're not going to dwell on that today, but we make sense out of the behavior influences with our 6 boxes model, which is a plain English sort of evolution from Tom Gilbert's behavior engineering model. We're going to not talk about all of that today. We want to go back to the performance chain. So what we know, of course, is that whatever those behavior influences are that support or get in the way of behavior, hopefully they do support the behavior to produce the accomplishments or the work outputs that contribute to organizational results. And of course, we analyze and plan from the, starting with the end in mind. So that's a pretty classic approach to things. But of course, what we're talking about today is work outputs or criteria, plus, and I want to emphasize this, criteria for a good one, and we'll come back to that. And then, of course, we say that work outputs or accomplishments are valuable, to use Tom Gilbert's word, because they credibly contribute to organizational level or business results. So that's kind of how we think about the elements. Now, if you go back to Harless's guidelines, this is really where I realized this week more than ever how I sort of diverge from Joe in a small way. Because, for example, if an organizational accomplishment is profits from products, I don't buy that, because what I would say is that an accomplishment, first of all, it needs to be a countable thing, literally a thing. Now, it can be tangible or intangible. It can be a widget, it can also be a decision or a relationship or a suggestion, but it's a thing. And one way to check on that is, can you use the word a or an before it or make it plural? So I can't say, I don't know what a profit is. Profits are generally a business result, which are an aggregate of things, just like productivity is the aggregate of some things that are produced. So I would argue that that is not an accomplishment, that is a business result. I would also say products in inventory, certainly you can count those products one at a time. That's a good output. But product sales, I don't know about. And so I have a question mark there. I don't know if we're talking about each sale, a closed deal, in other words. Yes, that's a countable thing. It's you can talk about multiples, et cetera. But if it's some sort of aggregate measure of product sales revenues, I would say it's a business result. Job accomplishment, advertising, I don't know what that is. If it's an advertisement, that's one thing. But advertising linguistically is like a verbal, It's not a noun, really, and you can't say advertisings. So I would not call that a work output or an accomplishment. A sales plan is surely an output. Sales presentations, however, are ambiguous. And anybody who's been through my program knows that I get real nitpicky about that because the presentation is behavior. And you want to get something at the end of it, a decision or people who clap or business cards that they give you. But the sales presentation itself is behavior. Now, the PowerPoint file is an output. So when people start telling me things like, a presentation is an output, I say, wait a minute, what are we talking about? Are we talking about the slide deck? Are we talking about the activity of getting up in front of people and speaking and hoping you can produce an output? So that I would cross off my list too as ambiguous at least. And call priority is an interesting one because to me that sounds like a decision or a prioritized list. So I don't exactly know what it means. I would want to use different language for it. So this is some of the nitpicky stuff that I would bring to the table on this, but I think it's very important because, for example, if I'm going to say profits are an output, I don't actually know how to show you the tasks or tactics or steps for producing those. I can certainly lay out a sales process that has a whole bunch of steps in it, but those have very specific outputs like requests for proposals and closed deals. Those are not, you get profits out of a whole bunch of those. So that's why I'm as nitpicky as I am about this stuff. So we come back to the Binder, performance thinking thing, where simplicity is a big part of it, and also we distinguish between organizational business results and accomplishments. And one of the reasons we also do that is because if you step back and you're a manager or a leader or a performance professional, and you're trying to engage the people whose performance you're trying to support and enable, and a lot of their day-to-day stuff is activity. But if we can highlight what that activity produces, the valuable products, that links them to business results. So if we can talk to a salesperson about closed deals or appointments in their calendar or about, requests for proposal from the client, those are all outputs that credibly contribute to business results, which is sales revenue. So the distinction between the product of behavior and the organizational level aggregate result, I think, is an important one for conversation and for analysis. But there's another thing, and this really goes to the title here, the topic. This countable nouns come in different chunk sizes. So that's when we come back to the sort of Goldilocks challenge. What's the best size? And again, crediting Scott, because this was a great insight. I loved thinking about it this way. So this is how we think about it. And it's really pretty simple. First thing is, one of the things, in fact, those of you who've been through our programs know we have a spreadsheet that we use, which is kind of the workhorse of analysis. We call it the multi-table. And the reason we call it the multi-table is we started out for years using Word document tables. And so we had to have a bunch of versions of them. But the nice thing about Excel, even though it's a lousy word processor, is you can hide columns when you're not using them. But in any event, we used to have a column that said major or sub-output, or major or sub-accomplishment. And I inherited that from Joe Harless, because he used to make that distinction, as you saw in that sort of tree structure that I showed you a while ago. But what I realized a few years ago is that that's really meaningless, because we can almost always chunk up or chunk down. We can say, a Toyota ready to go off the assembly line, or we can say a bolt screwed into the right tightness in the body somewhere. So in most cases, we can chunk up and chunk down. So I think it's relative. I don't find that distinction very useful. Now, we might ask, in a process, for example, if a process has a series of steps in it that individuals perform, or even small teams perform, or if an individual produces something, then we can come up with a right chunk size, probably, where we can say, oh, let me watch you do that, or let me do a task analysis, or let me figure out what the behavior is needed to produce that, so that I can, so that I can help you or support that or what have you. So there's a certain practical matter about, is the chunk size such that we can actually analyze the behavior effectively. And then, of course, we can get way too small. I mean, my silly example of that one is it's tax time now, isn't it? Or it's getting there. So, filling out an IRS form, depending on whether you're a company or an individual, can be pretty complicated. And the different fields in that IRS form, some of them require an entirely different set of behavior, like all of your charitable contributions, all of your revenue minus your expenses. Those are whole different sets of things. And so the fields in the IRS form are themselves, if they're complete and accurate, are themselves an important output. But we can get down to letters spelled correctly in the fields, and that's probably getting too small. And so what's right? I think the sort of judgment we have to make when we're looking at accomplishments is what's the level of a thing, literally a thing, for which we can list either the steps or tasks, or possibly the tactics, but where we can then say, okay, there's a set of behavior influences that will support this, and they kind of hang together. So this is not as precise as you might like, but this is the way I think about it. And what I also think is that those of us who've been doing this for a while, in the beginning, it's challenging. Just in the beginning, getting people to get rid of the verbs and define the products is hard. And I've learned that we humans aren't very good at that usually. But here's some examples. Is a relationship an actionable work output? I think it is. I think I can define a relationship with an individual client, and I can say what a good one is, and I can talk about at least the tactics for improving it, or a personal relationship for that matter. We did a webinar on this a few years ago. Or materials ready for class. Let's say I'm a teacher or I'm a tutor. All my materials ready on the desk, open to the right place, ready for the kid, ready. We can check that off. It's a thing. We can define that. Or a request for proposal from a prospective customer. You could say, well, wait a minute, that sounds like behavior to me. But for a salesperson, that's an output. Like I'm trying to get my customer to say, hey, could you give me a proposal? So you could think of that as an output or an advance or a milestone in the sales process. And so when we start thinking about it, one of the reasons that we're trying to find the right chunk size is, can we be sure to identify the behavior? Because that's what we got to be able to do if we're going to optimize the thing. And sometimes we can just list the tasks, or maybe it's an output of a single task. Or sometimes there's tactics. And when I use that word, I always mean things that aren't specified too precisely, but you know what I mean. So stay in touch with your customer on a regular basis. Now, if you're an experienced salesperson, you'll probably know what that is in a particular customer. It's not like dial the phone and pick it up. It's not step-by-step task, but it's try to stay in touch so you're familiar with your client, maybe every few weeks, maybe, or whatever makes sense, but it's a tactic we can specify. And you can do that in a lot of areas. Or maybe they're products of the steps inside of processes. The real question is what's useful in our level of analysis. So here's some examples, and they may not be the best example. I've sort of pointed to a few of them already, but maybe a car ready to roll off the assembly line is a little bit big. Now we can go through a whole set of process maps and such. Yeah, Joe has got a point in the thing here, which is things are needed in the process. Very often the output is the thing that's needed by the next step. So that helps define it. Processes turn out to be easier than it rolls to define the outputs of. So anyway, car ready to roll off the assembly line is maybe too big. The steering wheel assembly is something that turns out an individual person working on the line can produce. And maybe one lug nut in the wheel is a little bit fine-grained, unless we're just teaching people how to screw in lug nuts. Or an IRS form with all the sections complete. That's pretty big. That's going to have a whole bunch of procedures for different sub-outputs, like in a process. A particular field or section complete might be about the right chunk size. A single digit or letter in the IRS form, it's an output, but it's not very useful. Or a server farm for a cloud service. I was reading about the now infamous Elon Musk recently, and how when he took over Twitter, he decided they should eliminate one of their server farms. Basically, it was too expensive. So they said, "Oh, Elon, this is going to take weeks, and we'll need trucks and all that." So he said, "Okay, I'm just going to go over there." So he literally, with his guys, went over there with a wire cutter and took them down. So he actually did take down a server farm, more or less. But a sub output of that, if you were assembling it or trying to define how to do it, might be a single PC properly installed in a rack, of which there may be thousands. And probably an AC power cord in the socket of the PC is a little bit too small of a chunk, unless you're teaching somebody who has no idea about anything how to do something. Or a regional sales plan, that's pretty big because that's a whole bunch of accounts. In order to do that, you probably need to have your account plans because you need to roll them up. And maybe the name of the key decision maker in a plan is an important thing because you'd have to figure out how to get the name of that person, but it's kind of a small bit. So I use these examples to show different chunk size. I'm looking at Buddy's comment. For authors, a paragraph is too small. A section or chapter is about right. The entire book is too big. Exactly. This is why I've not written any books yet. I'm pretty good at the paragraph and 3,000 page article level, but I'm not so good at the 30,000 word level. So what I wonder is in the chat box, given that a few of you are responding, what are some examples, and following on Buddy's example, what are some examples of things that are sort of too small to be useful or too big to be useful? You got any ideas? Just looking in the chat box, see if anybody will respond. Well, maybe not. Think about your own work. And if there's anything that seems sort of too big to chunk off as a single thing for which you could define the behavior. Because that's what I'm pointing to here, that in our analysis process, as whether we're coaches or performance consultants, what we want to do is define performance in a way that's manageable. Okay, Kate Graham, a training program. Yeah, that's a pretty big one. Maybe a module of it. Therese, very good point. Depends on how you're going to use it. And I think what I'm pointing to right now is we're going to use it in an analysis. But I think it depends is probably the best answer to this question. I think you could probably come up with ones that were too big, like an entire workforce ready to go, and maybe small things that don't make much of a difference. You could argue, to follow Erwin's comment, that you don't want to get a number wrong in your IRS form. You got one number wrong and you're in big trouble. So that contributes certainly. But if we were teaching people or giving people a job aid or whatever to do it, that might be a little small chunk size. And then Buddy says, creating an action piece in the training course is too small. A module's about right. Yeah. And so, Buddy, I think you're pointing to exactly what Therese was suggesting and other people here, which is it's really a matter of pragmatism. It's kind of figuring out what's useful. And so thank you for those examples. Now, of course, when we're talking about individuals, many of you, again, if you've been through our programs or looked at some of our webinars, you know that we sort of invented really this thing we call an individual performance map. There are people who do similar things, but this defines a role. And so we can interview an individual and figure out who their customers are. And then the bullets are their outputs. And if you look at these, some of them are big and some are small, but they're all products for that person. And the chunk size is such that they can define what it is that they have to produce. So here's a clinical supervisor. Let's see who's here. I want to see if there are any behaviorists in the room. There's a few people here who have a background in behavior science. And so if you were in the applied behavior analysis world, this might be a familiar world for you, and you'd recognize that BCBAs, which are board certified behavior analysts, who often serve as clinical supervisors, they've got a big, hairy job with a lot of outputs there. Or, for example, here we go, an associate professor. This was actually an associate professor in Sweden some years ago. Yeah, so Marty is talking about Buddy, a doctorate in behavior analysis. Yeah, good example. Marty, other factors in selecting targets include controllability, measure, all those things. That's true. And again, but notice that you're talking about a target, perhaps, or a goal even. And so it's kind of going back to Teresa's, how you're going to use it. Here's a human resource director, a specific guy in a small medical devices company years ago, but these are all things. And you can even do it in processes. So, for example, here's the previous thing was a whole process that our brilliant colleague Holly Alman gave me. It's been sanitized a little bit, but this is a not only good but beautiful process map that you can see down the left has a whole bunch of players in it, performers, and then it has a whole bunch of output steps. But the purple things are the outputs that she attached to each step. And so one of the things that I love, and this kind of goes to what Joe was talking about, is, and a couple of other people, I guess, is that in some ways, processes are a relatively easy place to figure out what the chunk size is and what the outputs are. And I wouldn't have necessarily thought about it that way until a few years ago. But I used to be intimidated by very sophisticated process people. And I think there's a few people in this group who are in that category. And they have a lot of tools, like Six Sigma guys, lean process people. They have a lot of tools. They have a lot of data, really impressive professional practice they have. But I wound up then working in a few different organizations in parallel with quality and process folks. And they did their thing and I did my thing. And they told me at the end there were two very important things that performance thinking added to the table. One of them is the 6 boxes model, which is a really useful framework for doing root cause analysis and the kind of things that process people need to do when they're trying to figure out why they're getting defects, for example. Instead of just saying, well, it was human error, the 6 boxes model is a way of thinking about how come there was a human error. But what they also said to me is that a lot of process people don't actually do a very good job of defining the output of each step in a process. They're very good at defining the final product, but but in fact, they don't always identify. They have the steps, but they don't always have the outputs in each step. And what we've learned, and good process people do this for sure, but what we've learned is that if you can define the output of each step, first of all, as Joe mentioned earlier in the chat box, one of the nice things about a process is you have to meet the requirements of the next downstream step. So your customer is the person doing the next step, whether it's you or someone else. And so the requirements for this output, this draft, this revised document, this widget ready to assemble into a larger assembly, it needs to meet criteria for a good one that are what's needed in the next step. And so the way we typically do processes is we define the steps, we get people together and figure out what are the steps in this, what's the sequence, and then we focus in on the steps and figure out what each one produces. So in many ways, processes are an easy way to figure out what the outputs are if you go about it in that way. And here's another example. You can probably not read this very well, but I think this is a brilliant example from Scott that came after our conversation, where he did at his company recently. He basically revolutionized how they did training. He did a version of enabling people who knew the job to then become dedicated trainers. And so if you look down the left, it's all the tasks that these people have to do, all the way from developing a task list for the job to completing training records and everything in between. And then the results are basically the output of each step. And so from my perspective, this is the way to do performance analysis and training, where you figure out what the behavior is and what the outputs are. So that's a really nice example. And of course, in our coaching program, and when you're managing and supervising people, focusing on work outputs that are a chunk size that you can have a conversation about, that you can help the person to produce a better one of, that you can send them over to somebody who does it really well and have them watch it and so forth, makes a difference. So we, of course, think that if you take this approach and you're accomplishment-based, you can basically inform every single step in talent development, from recruitment all the way to ongoing development in an agile coaching process. And we did a webinar on this a few years ago, which the top QR code will take you to. And then I published an article in TD Magazine last summer about accomplishment-based talent development, and that QR code will take you to the online version of that. So here's some takeaways, because we're going to have a lot of time here at the end, and we can, of course, stop short if you want, but let's see what the conversation leads to. First of all, in my view, it's very helpful to distinguish between accomplishments and organizational business results, because accomplishments are things that I can point to or talk about, and we can count objectively 1, 2, 3, good proposals, good widgets, good decisions, and we can define what a good one is with what we call criteria. And organizational results are usually some sort of aggregate, usually measured in the aggregate, like sales revenue or customer satisfaction or safety or what have you. Those are very important things. Presumably at the organizational level, they define what that organization needs to be or have, if you will, or achieve to pursue its mission successfully. And they're the way we relate back to the accomplishments or outputs of people, processes, and teams to identify to what extent those outputs or accomplishments are valuable. So I believe that's a really important distinction that Harless and Gilbert did not really make, but for me at least, it's enormously clarifying. And then the second bit is, and this sort of goes along with a lot of the comments you all been making, they need to be at a chunk size that lets us list the steps, tasks, or tactics. In other words, they need to be practical. It's a pragmatic consideration. And that's what I think it boils down to. And I think there's a certain craft that we develop, even figuring out what the outputs are sometimes. And there's a phrase that comes out of behavior science that maybe almost nobody here has ever heard of, but it's natural lines of fracture. And what it means is the way things, sort of the way they function, normally kind of break up. And so I think if we look at the performance in a process or of a role of a person, the chunk sizes are basically along natural size. We do these sets of things and produce this thing together. It may have some parts, and we can define the parts we want to, but the thing itself hangs together, and the behavior influences and support it hang together. In the end, though, this is what I came to after thinking about this, which is the chunk size can make a difference in all the ways we've been discussing here and that you've contributed in the chat box. But I think the critical feature of an accomplishment is that it is a thing, literally a thing. And it might be physical or it might not be. It can be a widget or a proposal document or whatever. It can also be a relationship or a decision, which maybe is a little more tenuous in the sense that it's not, you can't, put it on the table, but it's a thing and we can define what a good one is. And to me, it's the product of behavior. It's valuable. And I think this is important. It can be identified as a good one or not. So in a process, we want to have the good widgets and the defective ones. We want to count those. If we're making hiring decisions, we want to retroactively say that was a good one and that was not so good one. If we're submitting proposals, we want those proposals to meet certain criteria, including they sell the deal, but especially the criteria we sort of think in advance will make a difference. If you have an output or an accomplishment, it needs to be a thing where we can evaluate whether it's a good one or not, and then we can count them. So to me, this is kind of the bottom line, really. That's where it ends up. And so I wonder, I'm just looking again to look at all your comments. And we can, I've set it up this time so people want to speak. We can do that. I've learned a couple of times when Erwin has been with us, which she is again today, that we actually can do that thing pretty effectively if somebody wants to speak. So I don't know if anybody wants to ask or say something or make a contribution, but we could certainly do that if you'd like. Or make comments. So let's see what we got. We got any more stuff in the chat box? I mean, is this useful? Okay, so here's somebody who wants to speak. So Craig wants to speak. Go for it, man. I'm not sure what you have to do at your end, but I just approved you. Okay, and Erwin also wants to speak. I don't know how this is going to work if we have multiple players. Can you guys figure out what you do at your end? Because all I can do is click on something and then it accepts your request, but I can't figure out exactly how you then show up here. Oops. Erwin has joined the room.
Carl, can you hear me?
Yeah, I think I can hear two of you.
This is Erwin. I turned off my camera.
Yeah, I'm trying to hear. There's something in the background, and maybe this is.
Right. Yeah, just a second.
Okay, so that's not a competing. That's not Buddy or whoever it was that won.
A correlation between predicted difficulty and the true difficulty of the question as measured by.
Yeah, we gotta get rid of that. Okay, go for it. So, what do you think?
Well, I think there's a reason they're coaches, and the reason is people don't know how to do what you just described.
Mm-hmm.
Especially at the at the high level, where you had the org chart that showed product sales.
Yeah.
I can put a verb in front of that: increase product sales. Right?
Sure. Yeah.
But that's not as good as saying we need to increase product sales by 50%, or we're going to go out of business, right?
Well, that's fair, although there's a distinction that we tend to make, which is the elements of performance, how we measure it, and then goals, which are some level in the measurement. But keep going.
Okay, so what I was just saying is the part where we have to increase sales by 50%, the part where coaching comes in especially is, and here's why. It's remarkable how many people in leadership roles don't know how to explain things well to their people.
Oh yeah.
They may use a SMART goal, which I'm not a big fan of, but they may use a SMART goal without providing enough context for people to know the flavor that they have to set. And so people use coaches to help them through all that stuff. And that's very valuable in most organizations.
I agree, Erwin. Now, but coming back to the topic of accomplishments, the problem I would say about increasing product sales is until I've defined the milestones or the advances in the process that goes from prospects to closed deal, which are all outputs, I have no idea how to increase sales. So
yeah, but if you're
sales, just hold on. Sales is a business result, and that's great. It's important, but we need to look at the performance involved of what you need to accomplish or achieve along the way to do that. Is the point I would make.
I don't fundamentally disagree with that. Somebody has to do that. But when you're a leader in an organization, you have people that you want to do that for you.
Yes.
They have people they want to do the sub goals.
Yep.
And so the challenge is always the communication flow within the organization. It's like the game of telephone. The CEO can be perfectly clear, and by the time it reaches lower levels, it's not what it looks like.
Well, yeah, there's two thoughts I would have about that. One of them is my experience is that the two models we have make that a lot easier, because people can talk about the business results and then they say, okay, what are the milestones of the accomplishments of the work outputs you need? Now, one of the most important kinds of projects that I and my colleagues have done over the last 30 years is something that just blows my mind. I have yet to see many other companies do this, is we will interview successful salespeople and figure out what all the small outputs that they would think of as advances in the sales process, whether it's qualified prospect that has a certain criterion, or appointment in the calendar, or a relationship with the CFO, or whatever it is. Those things, you can actually look at what a successful salesperson for a given product, company, and market needs to accomplish step by step to get there. You can document that, and then nobody has to guess. You just say, what are you working on in your account this week? Let me help you achieve that. So I agree with you about that, but I think that clarifying accomplishments that lead to business results is a big part of it.
Well, let me give you a different example. Many years ago, really many years ago, Florida Power and Light, before it became modern, Florida had lots of hurricanes and they didn't predict them very well. And so power lines were always falling and they were in remote regions and near swamps and so forth. And so their reliability of their service as an organization was maybe 60% reliable.
Uh-huh.
And the CEO set a goal to get it up to at least 90% reliable. And the way he communicated that goal was he said, every single person in the organization figure out to do something that improves the reliability of what you do or can impact our reliability. And
Uh-huh.
the way that translated is the people that put the poles in the ground started thinking about how to do that, and they figured out a lot of the poles were being hit by drunk drivers and cars in the dark, and they knocked down the telephone poles, and it took a long time to get them back up and running. They figured out by moving the poles inland away from the street, they could reduce the likelihood of a car hitting them.
Mm-hmm.
That was all the figuring out stuff that produced the result throughout the
Right.
organization.
Well, notice that they teaching them how to behave wouldn't have helped much, but they just
Agree.
defined an output. The output was pole moved away from the street. That's the
Right.
output that they.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Mhm. Well, that sounds like Bainbridge Island, by the way, because we've gotten better at that. But that's good comment. Good, thank you for that. I'm wondering though, we've just got a few more minutes. Are there any others who would have comments or questions? I'm seeing Buddy talks about like breaking down the creation of an RFP response. Yeah, so there's a bunch of details in there for sure. Outputs. Um, Anybody else? Or Buddy, cumulative core steps that add up to corporate throughput. But again, the steps tend to point to behavior, and we're talking about the output or the accomplishment of that behavior. So, and your doctoral thing. Anything else that people want to add? Thank you, Ern, for your comment. All right. Well, if there's no other contributions, I really appreciate your contributions and this has been a pretty active behavior needs targets. There you go. That's a good way to put it. Well, it's interesting because as I mentioned, we've done a lot of work in sales enablement over the years. And I've had a lot of times when I've interviewed salespeople, successful salespeople, where there was some sort of behavioral coaching program. And their managers would ride with them and had a whole bunch of behavior they expected, like deliver the message, ask open-ended questions, whatever it was. And we were not asking that. We would say, what are the things you're trying to achieve or accomplish at each step in the process? And I've on more than one occasion asked such salespeople, well, how's that behavioral coaching program going for you? And they would say, well, when my manager rides with me, I know what's on her checklist, and I sort of, I kind of, do that. But if she's not with me, I'm not talking about that. I'm trying to get the next advance. I'm trying to figure out what I want to accomplish in the next meeting, like an appointment with the CFO or a request for proposal or decision to move forward or what have you. So good salespeople have what they call advances, which are usually outputs or accomplishments. They're not behavior. So I'm looking at stretch goals. Erwin, I don't know. This session was not intended to be about goals, so I'm not sure where that came from. But to me, a stretch goal might include we want 3 proposals out this week rather than 1. You can set a goal for behavior. You can set a goal for outputs. You can set a goal for business results, but if you're going to set the goal for business results, you better tell people what the accomplishments are that will lead to them. I'm looking at John's comment. The system works for both improving a process and developing and implementing. Yes, that's absolutely true. Marty. No, I agree, Marty. Salespeople don't, but my experience has been that if we interview top salespeople, successful, ideally exemplary ones, or exemplary ones sometimes there's subgroups that depends on the product, depends on whatever, but we will capture small milestones or outputs that they're trying to achieve and apparently lead them to better sales. A kind of a funny example to me is I've worked with a lot of pharmaceutical and medical devices sales organizations, and a couple of them have told me, like if they're selling to doctors, let's say they're trying to get a doctor to prescribe their medication, they're never going to get a doctor to say, well, I guarantee I'm going to always prescribe your medication. They'll never be that way with a salesperson, or usually not. But they said, an output I'm looking for, they would call it an advance or a milestone, is doctor indicates by her body language and facial expression that she agrees with a clinical statement I just made. Now that's pretty subtle, but I can see how it's very important in an environment where there's no other way you're going to find out if the person agrees with you or not. So, Craig, really good question. Craig's question is, are accomplishment, result, and output the same? I don't know, because result means different stuff to different people. So I don't use words like result and outcome if I can help it, because it could mean anything. When I coined the phrase work output about 20 years ago to mean what we mean by accomplishment. And that's because even though I love the word accomplishment, it sometimes, certainly in the history, as I pointed out, gets confused with what I would think of as business results. So we talk about being accomplishment based, but to clarify that, and because I don't want to get in arguments with people about what accomplishment means, we coined the phrase work output to mean products of behavior that you can count. So in our vocabulary, accomplishment is a beautiful word. It sounds valuable, but others define it in different ways if you look out into the field. So we talk about being accomplishment based, but the vocabulary we use is work outputs. And then results, I have no idea what that means. It could be all kinds of stuff. It could be changes in business results. It could be, who knows? So I try to avoid that one. Anyway, thank you, everybody. I think we're more or less at the end. Oops. Can performance objectives be seen as work outputs? I think the question, Liz, is the other way around, because you can have performance objectives. A lot of people will set performance objectives which are to achieve some business result, or they'll behave differently. But I do believe that the best way to set an objective for performance is to say you want to produce this. You want to produce a customer who says yes. You want to produce a widget that meets these criteria. So my suggestion is you turn your sentence around and you say work outputs make for really good performance objectives. Anyway, thank you, everybody. I think our time is pretty much up. I hope this has been a good conversation for you. I'm going to sort of end this right now.